Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is Sandra Brown with the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction and Public Pathology Education. Today I'm going to be talking about the issue of pathological love relationships and how those came about, a little background on those. So I began in the field over 30 years ago, and for whatever reason, which I can't imagine now, as a new student out of graduate school, I decided to open a personality disorder center or program for those who had personality disorders. Like I said, I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, especially because it's difficult work and it's not usually work people coming right out of graduate school do. So I began working with people who had personality disorders that ranged anywhere from, I had a group for women, mostly that had borderline personality disorder, and then I had male clients that had sort of disorders up on the upper spectrum in pathology and psychopathology, narcissism, antisocial, even further up the spectrum in the disorders of psychopathy. And so I worked with them for about 12 years, and it was during those 12 years that they began to bring in their partners, because one of the things that is connected to personality disorders is this very poor quality of interpersonal relationships. It's just part of what personality disorders struggle with. And sooner or later, you know, their relationship issues would come up and they would want to bring their partners in. And this was mostly with the male population of people, clients who had personality disorders, bringing in their female partners. And that's how I began paying attention to the relationship dynamics connected, you know, to these people who have personality disorders. And during that time period of, you know, just paying attention to the relationship dynamics, I had also been trained in trauma and had written a book about victimization called Counseling Victims of Violence. And then in that book was a focus on different types of victimizations, but one of them was relational aggression or domestic violence. So I had a, you know, a background in victimization. And so as I was listening to the client and their survivor partner, in my mind, I was comparing and contrasting what they were describing to the traditional domestic violence model. And this was back in the late 80s and the early 1990s, and what the model of victimization and relational aggression was at that time. And um, while these pathological relationships, or PLRs as we call them, while these PLRs absolutely had aggression in the relationship dynamics, whether it was emotional, verbal, psychological, physical, sexual, spiritual, financial, there were aspects of it for me that did not fit. And as much as I was trying to fall back on the domestic violence model for treating the survivor partner, there were big chunks of that that did not fit for me in the treatment model. And it was over the years that of working with the women, continuing with the pathological partner, doing both of these things simultaneously, that I just started noting to myself some of the differences and the ways in which these PLRs were different in some ways than the DV model. Consequently, trying to take that DV model and working with the survivor partners didn't always work. And I had this big white write-on board in my office, and for years I didn't erase it. I just kept putting the information that I was getting from these survivor partners up on this write-on board, writing sort of the differences and how these things were not aligning with the other DV theory. And I put things up there such as the survivor partner's history. So DV theory is highly predicated, at least back then, on the theory that the survivors have a history of aversive childhoods, that they grew up in a home in which there probably was domestic violence. They viewed some form of aggression between their parents. The parents could also have other mental health problems, criminality, addictions, things like that. And some of the survivor partners did indeed have those kinds of histories. But there was an alarmingly large amount of survivor partners who did not have aversive childhoods. They came from normal enough families where there weren't all those elements that we associate with DV theory in their history. And so that in DV theory, that is supposed to be part of the reason that survivors go on into these types of relationships, is because it was role modeled for them in early childhood. And so if that's part of the reason why survivors end up in these relationships, if they don't have that in their history, then what is the reason? And so on this whiteboard, I began to write, some of that information, some of the stuff of their histories that did not match what I had been taught. I also began to track these relationship dynamics. And while all domestic violence, can certainly be crazy in the relationship dynamics, these replicated the pathology in the pathological partner. You could actually see the symptoms of pathology in the relationship dynamics. And so on the whiteboard, I began to write down um, those aspects of pathology that were actually being played out in the relationship dynamics. Along NDV theory is also what they call the victim profile, and they developed it back in the early part of the late 60s or early 70s, when the domestic violence field was really starting to catch on. And what they did was they developed this kind of standardized profile of what a victim was. And they came to that conclusion of that profile based on the women who came through their shelter. And anybody utilizing shelter care, especially back then, the 60s and 70s, in which a lot of women were still not in the workforce and didn't have outside incomes. Any of the women who were inclined to utilize the shelter in order to escape were people who had certain socioeconomic backgrounds, educationally, perhaps the women, got married right out of school, didn't go on to college. And so all of those factors in the 60s and 70s contributed to what they felt like was a profile of their standardized shelter care background of these survivors. What I was finding was that a lot of the PLR survivors did not, were not like that type of profile. So perhaps it's because by then we were into the 1990s and up until early 2000. So women were going to school more. Women were having jobs more often. A lot of them did have their own source of income, etc. So it is into this thinking in which a lot of the women did not have aversive childhoods, and a lot of the women did not meet the criteria of the old model of DV profiling. And so here I have this bunch of women who had normal enough childhoods, so that's not why they ended up in it. And they weren't tied into the relationship necessarily based on socioeconomics. So that also put a big question mark in comparing to this old DV theory. Part of that old DV theory, again, taken in the 60s and 70s, in their profile was this profile of dependency, of low self-esteem, of learned helplessness, of battered women syndrome, all which is generated out of low self-esteem that was created way back when they were children in aversive childhoods watching domestic violence happen. So in this group, my group, the women didn't witness that, nor did they have chronically low self-esteem from early childhood onward. They had it right then in the moment because they were living in a pathological relationship uh, where there was a lot of various types of aggression. But you could tell from their histories that this was not a chronic type of low self-esteem that is associated with dependency and codependency. And so that was a differing factor. So that went on the whiteboard also. Then I also noticed that what is expected from intimate partner aggression, whatever form that is, verbal all the way up through sexual um, abuse, is that they will emerge from the relationships with trauma. Because I was trauma trained, I understood that and would assess them for trauma. And the vast majority of them did have trauma, but there were aspects of their trauma that were very different. Um, and for a long time, I couldn't put my finger on the atypicalness of it. There was something that was different that wasn't it. There was PTSD a lot of times, or acute stress disorder, or even complex PTSD, but there was this other thing in their trauma that seemed to be sort of the gorilla glue that held them in there in that relationship. And it was this different part of trauma that I hadn't quite figured out. And so I could see this atypicality and in its presentation, which turned out to be the thing that I named and have been studying now for over a decade, which is the issue about cognitive dissonance. And so this cognitive dissonance, this atypicality in their trauma also seemed to be connected to their own personality, the personality that did not match the domestic violence profile, but had its own unique aspects where it didn't generate out of this chronic low self-esteem from childhood onward, but yet had these elevated personality aspects in trust, tolerance, empathy, compassion, stick-to-itiveness, loyalty, highly relationship invested, commitment oriented. And there were aspects in that personality differences in them that seemed very connected to this traumatic, atypical outcome of cognitive dissonance. Somehow they were connected, and I hadn't figured it out. So on this big whiteboard that almost took up my whole wall was this ongoing, it looked like some science, mathematical or science equation that stayed on that board that I looked at for years, trying to figure out how all of those aspects somehow made it different than what we were used to seeing in intimate partner aggression. And it was from that work that I came up with the term of pathological love relationships that did differentiate this type of relationship from a more standardized type of batterer and victim. And PLRs became this um, design of the four components that I noticed that were connected to the differences in this type of relationship compared to DV. And so what was different is that, number one, it had to do with the pathological partner. In domestic violence, not all batterers are pathological. There are other reasons for why the intimate partner aggression happened. And I'm not going to go into all of those, but not all batterers have personality pathology, especially to this extent in this upper range of psychopathology in what we call the danger zone personalities. So the first notable thing was that the batterers were different. We were talking about a different subset of batterers, the most dangerous batterers, and research has backed this up. When we are talking about the pathological batter, we are talking about higher risk and recidivism, low treatment outcomes, higher levels of injury, higher levels of psychological coercion in the victim. There are aspects that really do set them apart. So this first element that in my mind established a PLR is that we're not talking about the average batterer here. We're talking about somebody that has, a severe disorder, some of the most severe, noted in the DSM, our diagnostic manual. So that was the first aspect. The second aspect was that the relational dynamics were more dramatic and erratic and very much reflected the partner's pathology in action. If you took the DSM and looked at the symptoms under narcissism, under antisocial, and if you looked at outside the DSM, the symptoms of psychopathy and Machiavellianism or sadism, those symptoms became the actions in the relationships. And so that was the second element to me in my mind, is that the relational dynamics reflected the disorder in action. The third difference, which would take years for me to figure out through research, both smaller research and then a complete collegiate research with Purdue University, was how the victims were different. And it was through the study of the survivors' super traits of personality that we were able to differentiate that we are not talking about the DV standardized profile. Just like pathological partners are a subgroup in battering, there was a subgroup in victims. Not all of not all victims are the same, and these survivors were proof of that, that there was very little connection at all between DV survivors and this level of survivors. And so through this, the studies that we did, and then going on to the collegiate actual research, that we were able to say we're talking about a different subgroup. Just like in the batters, there is a different subgroup of survivor typologies. And lastly, in my mind, is that their trauma, while they did have typical trauma, there were aspects of it that were atypical. And this too took a number of years for me to be able to track down that issue about cognitive dissonance and how it makes the traumatic presentation, the trauma presentation in the survivor slightly different, and why therapists were missing that. They were assuming that that manifestation of cognitive dissonance, without having it named and explained and taught to them, was dependency and codependency. And they had a lot of other assumptions for why the trauma turned out the way that it did. Sometimes they even missed the typical trauma altogether because this atypicality in the trauma threw them off. And so it was over the course of this, using this whiteboard that sat there for a number of years, where I finally came to saying these are the 4 things that are different in these types of relationship that need its own name, that need to be differentiated in both the abuser, the relationship dynamics, the survivor, and the resulting trauma. And over the course of time, when each one of those elements got flushed out, is when a lot of that material came out, either through our articles or books. And then we described them as puzzle pieces. And when connected, when the puzzle piece about the pathological partner, and the puzzle piece about the relational dynamics, and the puzzle piece about the survivor's super traits of personality, and with the puzzle piece of the atypical trauma, when you put those puzzle pieces together, that was the completed picture of the 4 elements that are seen in all pathological relationships. And then it became built from there into, what we are seeing today in narcissistic and psychopathic abuse theory, taking from those 4 elements that are common in all PLRs. And so that's how we got here. And that's how these PLRs are different and should be differentiated based on risk, the differentiations in abuser and victim, the traumatic outcomes, and that we are dealing with subgroups of the traditional DV batter and victim profiles. So I hope that helps to shed light on how PLRs are different. I know a lot of times that's confusing. I have therapists a lot that ask, isn't this just domestic violence? And that's what I thought in the beginning, and that's what led me down this path to identify PLRs and make sure that they are understood differently, approached differently and that the survivor's treatment is different because of it. Thank you for joining me today. This has been Sandra Brown from the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. Thank you.